My name is Caitlin Moore. I am 27 years old, a marine biologist who has spent the last 6 years studying the gray seal colony that lives along the rocks below Blackwater Point. And the night everything changed, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass inside my own lighthouse. It was 2:14 in the morning. I knew the time because I checked my phone out of pure instinct, the way you do when your body understands danger before your mind fully catches up to it. The sound had come from below, from the old machine room at the base of the tower where I kept 6 years of research equipment, water samples, tagging sensors, and the only working transmitter that tracked the colony's movements along the coastline. I did not call out. I did not turn on a single light. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept by the bed for exactly this kind of situation. Living alone on an exposed point of rock 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, and moved down the spiral stairs, one careful step at a time, my bare feet silent against the cold iron. The machine room door stood open. It should never have been open. I always locked it, out of habit more than fear, because until that night I had never actually needed to fear anything on this point, except weather and loose footing. Inside, my equipment lay in pieces across the floor, not fallen, not knocked over by accident. Smashed deliberately, the kind of destruction that takes time and intention. Glass vials shattered, the transmitter housing cracked open and gutted, 6 years of tagging data sitting on a hard drive that someone had taken the trouble to physically destroy with what looked like a hammer. On the wall above the workbench, written in something dark that I did not want to identify too closely in the dim light of my flashlight, were 4 words: "Sell it or else." I stood there in my own machine room at 2 in the morning, my heart hammering, understanding for the first time that my grandfather's lighthouse had just stopped being a quiet inheritance and started being something people were willing to break into a locked building at night to destroy. I did not know yet how far my own family was willing to go to get it away from me. I did not know that the 4 words on that wall were only the opening move in something that had been building for months before I ever noticed. And I definitely did not know that by the end of that week, I would be sitting in a boat in the dark, waiting for men who wanted to hurt me, with a police captain from the next county over crouched beside me with his hand on his radio. But that night, standing in the wreckage of 6 years of work, all I knew was that someone wanted me terrified enough to leave, and that whoever they were, they had chosen exactly the wrong woman to try that on. To understand how I ended up standing in that machine room at 2 in the morning, you need to understand what Blackwater Point actually was, because for most of my life, even I only understood half of it. My grandfather, Silas Moore, had been the keeper of Blackwater Point Light for almost 50 years, first as an actual employee of the Coast Guard back when the light still required a human hand to tend it, and later, once it was automated in the 80s, as the private caretaker of the property when the government sold the surrounding acreage to his family rather than demolish the tower entirely. Officially, my grandfather spent his retirement maintaining a historic landmark, giving the occasional tour to tourists who wandered up the coastal trail, and writing small articles for regional heritage newsletters about the light's role in shipping disasters a century earlier. Unofficially, and this part I only pieced together slowly over the 6 years I spent living there with him before he died, my grandfather had used his position at the point to build something considerably more consequential. In the early 90s, after watching 2 separate resort developments destroy nesting grounds along neighboring stretches of coastline, he had quietly established a small private conservation trust, funded mostly out of his own savings and a handful of donations from people who trusted him, and used that trust to acquire permanent protective easements across nearly the entire rocky shoreline surrounding the point. The seals came later, drawn to the newly undisturbed rocks the way wildlife eventually finds whatever space humans stop actively destroying. And by the time I arrived as a graduate student looking for a thesis site, Blackwater Point hosted one of the only stable gray seal breeding colonies left on that entire stretch of coast, protected almost entirely because one stubborn old lighthouse keeper had spent 30 years quietly making sure no developer could ever touch the land. My grandfather died 8 months before, that night in the machine room, in his sleep, at 83, the kind of ending that felt almost unfairly gentle for a man who had spent his whole life fighting quieter battles most people never noticed. His will left me the lighthouse, the surrounding acreage, and controlling authority over the conservation trust, passing over both his surviving son, my Uncle Roland, and my cousin Derek entirely. I understood why, even if I hadn't fully appreciated the weight of it at the time. Roland had never once, in all my visits over the years, expressed anything but polite boredom about the point itself, showing up occasionally for holidays and spending most of the visit checking his phone in the kitchen, while my grandfather and I walked the tide pools cataloging whatever had washed in that week. Derek, 8 years older than me, had grown up resenting the point entirely, calling it, more than once at family dinners, a waste of prime coastline that could be worth millions if anyone with actual business sense ever got hold of it. What I did not know, not until months after the funeral, was that Derek's business sense had already found somewhere to point itself. A development firm called Harrow Coastal Group had spent nearly 2 years quietly negotiating with Roland behind my grandfather's back, planning a resort and private marina development across the exact acreage the Conservation Trust protected, an agreement my grandfather had specifically vetoed twice while he was alive, each time reminding Roland, according to the Trust's own meeting minutes I found later in an old filing box, that the land existed to protect the colony, not to fund anyone's retirement. 3 weeks after the funeral, before I had even finished sorting through his personal effects, Roland showed up at the Lighthouse with Derek beside him, both of them dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than visiting a grieving relative, and made it clear within the first 5 minutes that they considered my inheritance a mistake that needed correcting. "You're 27, Roland said, standing in my grandfather's kitchen like he still owned some claim to it. "You're a scientist, not a property manager. This trust involves millions in easement rights, insurance liability, coastal permitting. Dad wasn't thinking clearly at the end, giving you all of it alone. I told him my grandfather had been perfectly clear right up until the week he died, according to his own doctor, whose notes I had already requested specifically because I suspected this conversation was coming. Derek's contribution to the conversation was less careful. "This place is worth $11 million to the right buyer," he said, like the number itself was supposed to change my mind. "You're going to sit here playing with seals while that money just sits in the ground doing nothing." I told them both, as calmly as I could manage while grief still sat raw in my chest, that the land wasn't for sale, that the trust existed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of development they were describing, and that my grandfather's wishes on that point had never once wavered in 30 years. They left that day without saying much else. I assumed foolishly that the conversation was over. It was not the last time either of them raised the subject, though the tone shifted considerably over the following months. Phone calls from Roland grew shorter and colder, always circling back to the same argument, that I was too young, too inexperienced, too impractical to manage something this valuable, framed each time with just enough concern in his voice to sound like family looking out for me, rather than a man calculating what my inheritance was costing him. Then the calls stopped entirely, right around the time strange things started happening at the point. The first incident, 3 weeks before the machine room break-in, seemed almost explainable on its own. My research boat, a small aluminum skiff I used to reach the outer rocks where the colony hauled out to breed, developed a mooring line that had frayed clean through overnight, the kind of fraying that should have taken months of weather exposure, not a single calm evening with no unusual wind at all. I told myself it was old rope, replaced it, and didn't think much more about it, because I wanted to believe the world was still the ordinary place it had always been. The second incident was harder to explain away. Walking back from the general store in the small harbor town 2 miles down the coastal road, 2 men I didn't recognize fell into step near me on the empty pier, close enough that their presence felt deliberate rather than accidental. "Nice quiet place out there at the point," one of them said, not quite looking at me directly. "Real isolated. Dangerous rocks at night too, I hear. Woman living alone out there. All sorts of things could happen, and nobody'd know for days." I kept walking, my pulse climbing, and didn't respond because responding felt like exactly what they wanted. They didn't follow me past the end of the pier, didn't do anything I could have reported as an actual crime, just walked in the opposite direction, laughing quietly to each other in a way that made my skin crawl for the rest of that night. I told Jackson about it that same evening, the first time I had actually said out loud, clearly, that I thought something more organized than bad luck was starting to happen around me. Jackson Reed ran the dive shop and coastal rescue station in the harbor town, had grown up there his whole life, and knew essentially everyone worth knowing along that stretch of coast. From the fishermen who still worked the traditional way to the county emergency services who called him personally whenever a swimmer went missing in the currents near the point. We had been together almost 2 years by then. Ever since he'd helped me haul equipment out to the outer rocks during my first season studying the colony. And if there was one person on this earth I trusted completely, it was him. He listened to the pier story without interrupting, his jaw tightening the way it did whenever something genuinely worried him rather than simply annoyed him. "That's not random," he said. "That's a message. Somebody wants you scared enough to leave without ever doing anything they could actually be arrested for." I asked him what he thought I should do. "Document everything," he said. "Every call, every weird interaction, every piece of damaged equipment. And let me start keeping a closer eye on the point itself, because if this escalates, I want proof before it does, not after." I did not fully understand how right he was until the night of the machine room, 10 days later. The morning after I found the wreckage and the words on the wall, I called the county sheriff's office, expecting, at minimum, someone to come take photographs and file a report. What I got instead was Deputy Wade Colton, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had grown up in the harbor town and, I would later learn, had grown up specifically in the same graduating class as Roland Moore. Colton walked through the machine room with visible reluctance, glancing at the destroyed equipment and the words on the wall with an expression that read more like inconvenience than concern. "Could be kids," he said, barely looking at the message on the wall. "Bored teenagers get out to these old places sometimes, break stuff up for fun. Kids don't smash a hard drive with a hammer and leave a written threat," I said. "This says sell it or else. That's not vandalism. That's intimidation." Colton's expression didn't change much. "I'll file a report," he said, in a tone that suggested filing was the entire extent of what he intended to do about it. Isolated place like this, hard to get much evidence anyway. You might just want to think about whether living way out here alone is really worth the trouble it seems to keep bringing you. I stood in my own machine room, staring at a deputy who had just told me, essentially, to consider giving up rather than pursue an actual investigation, and understood with a cold, settling clarity that whatever protection I thought local law enforcement might offer me did not actually exist, at least not through him. I called Jackson the moment Colton's truck pulled away from the point. "He didn't do anything, did he?" Jackson said. "It wasn't a question. He told me to think about whether living out here is worth the trouble," I said. Jackson went quiet for a moment, the particular quiet he got right before he made a decision, rather than simply reacted to one. "Colton's been close with Roland since high school," he said. "I should have thought of that sooner. Listen, I know someone who can actually help, but it means going outside the county entirely." He told me about Captain Elena Vasquez, who ran the Marine Patrol Division for the neighboring county, a jurisdiction that happened to share overlapping water rights with Blackwater Point because of an old boundary dispute from decades earlier that had never been fully resolved. Jackson had worked alongside her rescue teams for years during storm season and trusted her, he said, more than he trusted almost anyone wearing a badge in his own county. "She's sharp, and she can't stand Colton," he added. "If there's any legitimate angle for her to get involved out here, she'll take it seriously." Captain Vasquez came out to the point herself 2 days later, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who spent nearly an hour photographing the machine room, the message on the wall, and the frayed mooring line I'd kept as evidence without fully understanding why at the time. "This isn't kids," she said flatly, echoing exactly what I'd told Colton days earlier. "This is targeted intimidation, and if it's connected to a family inheritance dispute the way you're describing, I want everything documented from here forward. Every call, every interaction, Every piece of damage. If this escalates, and cases like this usually do escalate before they stop, I want a paper trail solid enough that nobody can wave it away as coincidence. I asked her carefully whether she could actually do anything, given that Blackwater Point technically sat inside Colton's jurisdiction, not hers. The water rights overlap gives me legitimate reason to patrol out here regularly, she said. And if something happens on that overlap, I have every right to respond and document it myself, regardless of what Colton wants to file or not file on his side of the line. I can't promise you jurisdiction over everything. I can promise you that from now on, somebody who actually takes this seriously is watching. Jackson, meanwhile, had already begun quietly reinforcing the point in ways I hadn't fully noticed until he explained them to me that same week. Weatherproof cameras, small enough to miss unless you knew exactly where to look, mounted along the base of the tower, the boathouse, and the narrow gravel road that provided the only vehicle access to the point. A second mooring line, checked personally every evening, and a habit, unspoken but immediately obvious, of finding reasons to be at the point himself most nights that week, staying later than usual, leaving later than usual, never quite saying out loud that he was standing guard, but doing exactly that regardless. "I love you," I told him one night, watching him check the boathouse locks for the second time that evening. "But I need you to know I'm not going to just hide up here waiting for them to make the next move. I want to actually find out what they're planning, not just survive whatever they throw at me next." "Then let's find out together," he said, "just carefully. Whoever's behind this already knows they can't fight you with lawyers, since your grandfather's paperwork is airtight. That means whatever comes next is going to keep happening in the dark, where nobody can prove it easily. We need to be smarter about the dark than they are." A week after Vasquez's first visit to the point, an unknown number called my phone just after midnight. 3 nights in a row. The first 2 times, whoever it was simply stayed silent on the line for close to a minute before hanging up, long enough that I could hear faint background noise, a television maybe, or a bar somewhere loud enough to blur the details. The third night, Jackson was sitting beside me when it rang, and he immediately reached over and hit record on the small digital recorder he had started keeping in his jacket pocket ever since the pier incident. This time, a voice spoke, low, deliberately flattened, clearly disguising itself. "Smart people know when to stop digging," it said. "Your grandfather got lucky for 30 years. Luck runs out eventually. Sell the point, and all this goes away quiet. Keep pushing, and it stops being quiet." The line went dead before I could say a single word back. Vasquez had that recording analyzed within 2 days, and while the voice itself couldn't be conclusively matched to anyone without a suspect already in custody, the burner phone's tower pings placed the call as originating from somewhere within a 4-mile radius that happened to include both Roland's house and the marina where Harrow Coastal Group kept a rented office trailer for the duration of their permit application process. "It's not enough to charge anyone yet," Vasquez told me. "But it's another thread in the same rope. Keep pulling them, and eventually the rope gets short enough that somebody's forced to hold on to it directly." That same week, unable to simply sit at the point waiting for the next threat to arrive, I spent 2 long nights at Jackson's kitchen table with my laptop, digging into Harrow Coastal Group's history the way I would normally research an unfamiliar species before writing about it, methodically, thoroughly, refusing to stop until the full shape of something became clear. What I found explained considerably more than I expected. 11 years earlier, a different Harrow development further up the coast had cleared a stretch of dune grass habitat for a marina expansion after an environmental review quietly downgraded the protected status of a shorebird nesting site there. A downgrade later reversed by the state, though only after the construction had already destroyed most of what the review was meant to protect in the first place. No charges were ever filed. The county's coastal permitting inspector at the time, according to an old regional newspaper archive I found buried 9 pages deep in a search result, had been a man named Wallace Hale. The same Hale, I realized, staring at the screen with my tea going cold beside me, whose voice sat waiting on an old cassette tape in my grandfather's lantern room cabinet. A decade before, either of us had any reason to know his name, mattered at all. "They've done this before," I told Jackson, my voice unsteady with the particular anger that comes from realizing a pattern is bigger and older than you first assumed. "This isn't just about my grandfather's land. This is just what they do, over and over, wherever the land is worth enough to make a review board look the other way." "Then let's make sure this is the last time it works," Jackson said quietly. The discovery that changed everything happened almost by accident, 12 days after the machine room break-in, while I was searching the old fog signal room at the base of the tower for spare parts to replace the equipment that had been destroyed. The fog signal room hadn't been used in decades, automated systems having long since replaced the manual foghorn my grandfather once operated by hand during his early years at the point, and most of what remained inside was simply old equipment nobody had bothered to remove. Tucked behind a rusted air compressor, wedged into a gap in the stone wall I nearly missed entirely, sat a metal storage trunk, padlocked, coated in enough dust to suggest it had been sitting undisturbed for years. I found the key 2 days later, taped to the underside of a drawer in my grandfather's old desk, labeled in his careful handwriting simply as fog room. Inside the trunk were nearly 30 years of my grandfather's private research journals, documenting, in obsessive, methodical detail, the exact history of the seal colony's return to Blackwater Point, tide pool surveys, breeding counts, water quality tests, everything he had personally used, decades earlier, to justify the original protective easements the Conservation Trust still relied on today. Buried beneath the journals sat something else entirely, a slim folder of old correspondence between my grandfather and a state wildlife official from the early 90s, confirming that the entire legal foundation of the Trust's protected status rested specifically on documented evidence of an endangered breeding population, evidence my grandfather had spent literal decades personally gathering. If that evidence disappeared or was successfully disputed, the protective status built on top of it could potentially be challenged as outdated or unsupported. Which meant, I realized with a cold jolt, that someone destroying my research equipment wasn't simply an act of intimidation. It was a direct attack on the only current, active proof that the colony still existed at all. Proof a hostile party could argue no longer needed protecting if nobody could produce a modern record showing it still did. I called Jackson immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I read him the correspondence over the phone. "They're not just trying to scare you off," he said slowly, understanding it at the same moment I did. "They're trying to make sure there's no current evidence left to defend the protection status at all. If your equipment's the only active proof, and it keeps getting destroyed faster than you can rebuild it, eventually there's nothing left standing between them and the resort deal except your grandfather's old paperwork. And old paperwork gets a lot easier to challenge in court once nobody can show the animals it protects are actually still out there." The final piece of evidence, the one that ultimately connected Roland directly and irrefutably to everything happening at the point, came from a source I hadn't even considered until Jackson mentioned it almost offhand one evening. "Your grandfather ran the old shortwave radio setup up in the lantern room for decades, right?" he said. "Coast Guard guys who worked these old lights. Some of them kept reel-to-reel recordings of channel traffic, habit from back when documentation actually mattered for insurance and incident reports. Did he ever mention keeping any of that?" I remembered then a cabinet in the lantern room I had always assumed held nothing but obsolete radio parts. One I had never bothered opening in the 8 months since the funeral. Inside sat a small collection of labeled cassette tapes, my grandfather's careful handwriting marking each one by year, spanning back over 2 decades. We found the relevant tape on our third night of searching through them. Dated 11 years earlier, my grandfather's voice calm and measured on the recording as he described logging routine channel traffic, followed by an exchange that made my stomach turn cold the moment I understood what I was hearing. A different, younger voice, one I recognized immediately despite the distortion of old tape and radio static, belonged unmistakably to Roland, caught mid-conversation with someone identified only as Inspector Hale, a name that meant nothing to me until Captain Vasquez later confirmed he had served as the county's coastal permitting inspector throughout most of that decade. "Look," Roland's voice said on the tape, tinny and distant, but entirely clear enough to understand every word if the survey comes back showing the easement's overreaching current wildlife guidelines. That's a permitting issue, not a legal one. Nobody's asking you to falsify anything. Just don't look too hard at the boundary lines this time around. And there's $20,000 in it for you personally, separate from anything official. My grandfather's own voice returned a moment later, having apparently been recording the frequency for entirely unrelated reasons, and stumbled onto the exchange by accident, his tone hardening immediately once he understood what he was hearing. "This channel isn't secure for whatever conversation you two think you're having," he said flatly, cutting directly into their exchange. "And Roland, if I ever hear you trying this again with anyone else out here, I will personally make sure every regulator on this coast knows exactly what you attempted today." The recording ended shortly after, my grandfather apparently having said everything he intended to say in that moment. I sat in the lantern room with Jackson at nearly midnight, the old cassette player between us, understanding fully for the first time that Roland's willingness to intimidate me over this land wasn't some new desperation born from my grandfather's death at all. It was simply the newest attempt in a pattern that had existed for over a decade, one my own grandfather had personally stopped once already, and one Roland had clearly been waiting years for the right opportunity to try again. "We need to get this to Captain Vasquez immediately," Jackson said. "Not just for you. If Hale's still working, permitting anywhere along this coast, this matters a lot more than just your inheritance." Captain Vasquez listened to the tape twice through in her patrol office, her expression growing increasingly focused with each pass. "This is attempted bribery of a public official, on top of everything else you've already documented," she said. "Hale retired 4 years ago, but bribery doesn't have an expiration date just because the person involved changed jobs. Combined with the intimidation pattern, the equipment destruction, the peer confrontation, this is enough for me to formally request state involvement, which takes it entirely out of Colton's hands whether he likes it or not." She asked me one more question before we left her office that night. "Do you think they're done escalating, or do you think they're building towards something bigger?" I thought about the message on my machine room wall, 4 words that had felt, even at the time, less like a final warning and more like an opening one. "I think they're going to try something bigger," I said, "soon, because they know now that scaring me hasn't worked. And I think Roland's the kind of man who doubles down rather than backs off once he's already invested this much." I was right, though I wish, even now, that I hadn't been. 4 nights later, at just past 11, Jackson's hidden camera near the gravel road access caught 2 vehicles approaching the point, with their headlights deliberately switched off, moving slowly along a road that led absolutely nowhere else, at an hour when no legitimate visitor had any reason to be anywhere near Blackwater Point at all. Jackson had already alerted Captain Vasquez the moment his phone pinged with the motion alert, both of us watching the grainy night vision feed from inside the boathouse, where we'd been quietly waiting every night that week. Exactly as we'd planned with her, once the pattern of escalation became impossible to ignore. "They're here," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady in the particular way it went whenever a real emergency required calm instead of panic. "Vasquez is 12 minutes out with backup. We need to just observe until she arrives, nothing more." Through the boathouse's narrow window, I watched 4 men emerge from the 2 vehicles, moving toward the tower with a confidence that told me clearly this wasn't meant to be another quiet act of vandalism performed and abandoned before anyone noticed. One of them carried what looked, even in poor light, unmistakably like a length of chain. Another carried a gas canister. "They're not here to threaten the equipment this time," I whispered, my pulse hammering hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "They're here to burn something down." The wind off the water carried their voices in fragments, low, unhurried, the particular calm of men who believed completely that nothing waited out here to stop them. I could hear the gravel shifting under their boots, the metallic scrape of the chain being adjusted against someone's shoulder, and beneath all of it, the steady, indifferent rhythm of waves against the rocks below the tower, entirely unconcerned with what was about to happen on the ground above them. "Stay here," Jackson said, though I could see even in the dark that leaving me alone in that boathouse was the last thing he actually wanted to do. I need to get eyes on which building they're targeting before Vasquez gets here, so she knows exactly where to move the second she arrives. 12 minutes had never felt so long in my entire life. I stood pressed against the cold boathouse wall, my phone gripped tight enough in my hand that my knuckles ached, watching Jackson's silhouette move low and careful along the rock line, close enough to observe, far enough to stay hidden. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run out there myself, to scream at the men circling my grandfather's tower, and every rational thought I still had left told me exactly what Jackson had already told me twice that week, that stepping out into that dark alone would only give them a hostage instead of evidence. I did not stay in that boathouse, not entirely, though I stayed far enough back to keep myself out of immediate danger, moving instead to the narrow gap between the boathouse and the rock face, where I could see the tower entrance clearly while remaining hidden in shadow. The 4 men split into 2 pairs, one moving toward the machine room entrance at the base of the tower, the other circling toward the lantern room stairs, and I understood, watching them move with the kind of coordination that suggested this had been planned carefully in advance, that Roland's people intended to destroy both my research space and my grandfather's original journals in the same night, erasing every remaining piece of evidence that the colony and the legal protection built around it had any active, documented existence left at all. I heard the distinct click of a lighter once, testing, somewhere near the machine room door, and had to force myself to stay still, my whole body coiled tight enough to shake, reminding myself over and over that Vasquez's boat was already crossing the dark water toward us, that 4 minutes of restraint now mattered more than any instinct I had to intervene alone. Captain Vasquez's patrol boat cut its engine and drifted the final approach silently, exactly as she'd promised during our planning that week, her team moving up the rocky shore path with flashlights, still switched off, timing their approach for the exact moment the 2 pairs of men reached the tower's entrances and committed fully to the buildings they intended to burn. The confrontation itself lasted less than 4 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, standing in the dark listening to it unfold. Vasquez's team took the pair at the machine room entrance first, quick, controlled, the gas canister secured before a single match was struck. The second pair, closer to the lantern room stairs, made it only a few steps further before flashlights snapped on around them from 3 directions at once. Vasquez's own voice cutting clearly through the night air, identifying herself and ordering them down onto the ground. One of the 4 men, once handcuffed and searched, carried a phone that Vasquez's team immediately flagged as evidence. A phone that, once properly subpoenaed in the following days, showed a text message thread confirming payment arrangements directly from a number registered to Derek Moore, sent less than 6 hours before the men arrived at the point that night. Roland himself was arrested 2 days later, not present at the scene that night, careful enough, or cowardly enough, to keep himself physically distant from the actual act, but unable to escape the combination of evidence that had accumulated against him by then, the recorded bribery attempt from over a decade earlier, the coordinated intimidation pattern Captain Vasquez had documented meticulously for weeks, and the direct financial trail connecting Derek's phone to the men caught mid-arson attempt on my grandfather's lighthouse. Deputy Colton was placed on administrative leave within the same week. Once state investigators reviewing the case discovered how consistently he had dismissed and buried every report I had personally filed with his office over the preceding month. A pattern too deliberate, once laid out chronologically, to explain away as simple incompetence. The resort deal with Harrow Coastal Group collapsed entirely within days of the arrests becoming public, the development firm issuing a brief statement distancing themselves completely from any involvement in what their lawyers carefully described as unrelated criminal matters concerning the property's prior ownership dispute, though the timing left very little room for anyone paying attention to believe the 2 things were actually unconnected. I sat with Captain Vasquez in her patrol office 3 weeks after that night on the rocks, going through the final paperwork that formally closed the state's involvement in the intimidation case. though the criminal proceedings against Roland, Derek, and the men they'd hired would stretch on considerably longer. "You did the hard part yourself," she told me, sliding the last of the paperwork across her desk. "Most people panic and either give up the fight or make some reckless mistake trying to handle it entirely alone. You documented everything, brought in people you trusted, and let it get built into something that would actually hold up, instead of just reacting out of fear the way they clearly hoped you would." I told her I couldn't have done any of it without Jackson, or without her willingness to take the case seriously when Colton wouldn't. "That's not weakness," she said. "That's just knowing which people in your life are actually worth trusting when everything else falls apart. Most people never figure that out until it's already too late to matter." 6 months later, standing at the top of the lantern room with Jackson beside me, watching the seal colony haul out onto the rocks below in the late afternoon light, exactly the way my grandfather had watched them for 30 years before I ever arrived, I finally allowed myself to feel something closer to peace than I had felt since the night I found broken glass scattered across my machine room floor. The Conservation Trust's protected status had been formally reaffirmed by the state, strengthened now, if anything, by the additional scrutiny the entire ordeal had brought to the original documentation my grandfather spent decades quietly compiling. My research equipment sat rebuilt and running again, better funded now through a modest grant that had come, somewhat unexpectedly, from a marine conservation nonprofit that had heard about the case through Captain Vasquez's official report and reached out entirely on their own. Roland's trial was still pending, along with Derek's, the evidence against both of them substantial enough that even their own attorney, according to courthouse gossip Jackson picked up from friends who worked nearby, had reportedly advised them to consider a plea deal rather than risk what a jury would likely decide once they heard that recorded bribery tape in full. I did not spend much time thinking about either of them anymore, not out of forced forgiveness, but simply because I had finally stopped needing to. Whatever Roland and Derek believed inheritance was supposed to mean, money extracted from land regardless of what it cost the life already living there, had never once matched what my grandfather actually built at Blackwater Point, and it had certainly never matched what I intended to keep building in his place. Jackson wrapped an arm around my shoulders as the last of the evening light stretched gold and orange across the water, the seals settling into their evening routine below us exactly as they always had, entirely unaware of how close they'd come to losing the quiet protection an old, stubborn lighthouse keeper had spent his whole life quietly building around them. "Your grandfather would be furious it took almost burning the place down before anyone finally listened," Jackson said quietly. I watched the colony settle against the darkening rocks, the light above us beginning its slow, automated rotation into the coming night, and thought about 4 words scrawled across a wall months earlier, meant to convince me that fear was the appropriate response to losing something worth protecting. He'd be furious, I agreed, but I think he'd also understand that some things are always going to be worth defending, no matter how much it costs to keep them standing. The light swept steadily across the water, exactly as it had for over a century, and for the first time since that night in the machine room, I finally believed, completely, that it would keep doing exactly that for a very long time still to come.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.